Hi, everyone, and welcome back for another conversation at the intersection of cutting edge science and spirituality. I'm Jennifer Cahill, and you are here with me today with Dr. Deepak Chopra and Professor Don Hoffman as we delve into a brand new uncharted territory, literally uncharted, as we explore the idea of evolution. Now, there's a fascinating article that Deepak Chopra has shared with Dawn and myself, and I would encourage everyone to check out from New Scientist. Thank you, Deepak. I think it just came out in December of this year. And what we're going to do in this special series is we're going to break down different elements. Evolution is something we could spend hundreds of hours discussing. And today we thought we would begin by talking about a little bit about the intelligence. Let's see here. Genes are not destiny. So let's start with that. That's the first part of the article is let's talk about the idea that we are no longer victims of our own heredity, as I once heard Dr. Bruce Lipton say. You know, it used to be years ago that we thought that if you had a certain genome, that meant you were destined to have something happen or not happen. And now science is beginning to unveil so many different elements, and we'll also explore a little bit today about the intelligence behind evolution. So Deepak, if you could start today for us by sharing a little bit about what we talked about at the end of the last episode about knowledge, and what if knowledge is something that evolution is helping us work towards, and what if it has its own consciousness? And then we can talk to Don about his idea about conscious agents and how that ties in.
That's great, Jennifer. So let me backtrack a little bit on this, a little bit of history, which is also interesting, contentious, and controversial. So in the year 2000, I gave a TED talk, and this was 2000. It's a long time ago, 20 years ago, 22 years ago. And my talk followed a talk by Richard Dawkins. And Richard was, of course, very well known in the world as an evolutionary biologist and has been teaching evolution at Oxford University, amongst other places, and is very well known for his book, The Selfish Gene. And unfortunately, after the talk, I kind of argued with Richard's thesis about the selfish gene. He was also at that time writing his book on the God delusion. And it was a little contentious, his take with me, particularly pseudoscience and all that. And since then, Richard Dawkins and I actually have had many encounters, including a debate in Mexico. And, it got complicated. We brought in Freeman Dyson into the discussion and many other people. And Richard maintained his old stance, which is random mutations, natural selection as the basis of all evolution. And at that time, by the way, no one was talking about epigenetics. And then that argument kind of faded. It's there on the internet if you want to go search for it, the TED controversy, as it's called. But then, in many years ago, I think it was almost 8 years ago, I met Rudy Tanzi at another conference called TED Med, which is the TED equivalent of medicine, let's say. And Rudy was talking about Alzheimer's genes, and he said something very interesting. And by the way, he discovered the first Alzheimer's gene. Rudy also discovered the gene for Wilson's disease. And actually, Rudy has discovered like 45 genes which are disease related. So he's an authority on genes. He also is the head of the genetics lab at Mass General Hospital at Harvard Medical School. And he's the vice chair of the Department of Neurology at Harvard. But he's not a clinician. He's a scientist, like Don. He's a scientist, a lab scientist, but very brilliant. And recently he's basically looked at decoded or been one of the people who's decoded the genes for COVID-19, the latest, and it's all published and getting good recognition. So genes, as far as genes are concerned, I consider Rudy an authority. And he also mentioned a few years ago to me that only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant. And now that's a very carefully worded statement. And since then, he said even more. He said less than 5%, maybe it's 3% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant. Let me explain what that means. So if somebody has a BRCA gene, for example, for breast cancer, as Angelina Jolie did, that gene predicts breast cancer. And she correctly had a preventive mastectomy for that. People are predicting that that can be cured in the future through gene editing, CRISPR, etc. Nevertheless, it still accounts for only 5% of disease-related gene mutations that guarantee the disease. The rest don't guarantee the disease. They put you at risk for disease. And in fact, the expression of those genes can be modified through lifestyle. Things like sleep, things like stress management, things like even deep breathing, things like controlled breathing or yoga or emotional resilience or changing your diet. For example, if you change your diet to a very rich, diverse, plant-based diet, you actually change 99% of the genes in your gut, which is most of the genetic information in your body is microbial. The 1% that is human, it's 25,000 genes. Now, depending on where you live, you have 2 million to 20 million microbial genes. And they are very important because they interact with human genes and produce all the metabolites in our body. Now, think of this. 99% of the genetic population can be changed in the body. And the 1% can be epigenetically upgraded. And we've shown that. We worked with Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine. She did a research study on a 1-week retreat with us. We showed in that 1 week, and this was published in Nature and other journals, in 1 week, all the genes that were responsible for homeostasis and self-regulation, they went up some 17-fold. The level of the enzyme telomerase went up 40% in 1 week. In fact, Elizabeth, the Nobel laureate, ended up writing a book based on this called The Telomere Effect, because she found that in other settings as well, not just with us. Those studies have now been replicated by other scientists. Our initial study was a collaboration between Harvard, Chopra Foundation, UCSD, UCSF, Duke University, Scripps, and Mount Sinai in New York. So it was a very highly pedigreed collaboration, and now it's been replicated elsewhere. Bottom line, gene activity is more important than genes. Genes are not nouns, they are verbs, and their activity can be modified through a mechanism called histone modification, demethylation, many things that Don would know much more than I would from a scientific point of view. But just knowing all this information right now is casting a doubt on the completely physicalist explanation of random mutations in natural selection and raising the possibility that genes are not deterministic, except for some, maybe for blue eyes, and I don't know. But definitely they're not deterministic for disease, 100%. They influence the outcome of disease. But how we interact with the environment and how we look at our bodies holistically rather than in a reductionist manner can lead to a completely different understanding of biological evolution and actually evolution of life on our planet. So we have in this issue about 13 topics, We may not get to all of them. Today, I would just like to raise the first one, genetic determinism. And basically, the first idea here, which is genes are not destiny. In other words, genetic determinism doesn't hold true in most cases, or maybe it is guided by other factors. So a completely new look at evolution on the planet, starting with this first topic. And I'll stop here and ask Dawn to just address this one question. Genes are not 100% deterministic, number one, and therefore not our destiny.
And therefore not, what was the last thing you said?
Therefore not our destiny, not destiny. Genes are not destiny.
Right. Right. So I think the way that most scientists in this area would think about it is, if we take the standard theory of evolution by natural selection quite seriously, right? Of course, that theory came along before we had the notion of genes, right? So Darwin had his idea of evolution well before, well, actually Mendel came up with genes, but and roughly contemporaneously, but they didn't know each other. And so it took decades before the two ideas were put together in a really intelligent fashion. We got the modern synthesis and so forth. So, and the attitude, I think there's a lot of debate. Of course, scientists who are evolutionary biologists, they agree on the importance of genes. They disagree on whether there's things like group selection or not, whether it's the natural selection works on groups or only on individuals and the genes of individuals and so forth. So there's good, healthy debate, which you would have in any healthy scientific field. I would say that most scientists right now do not think of genes, certainly not the simple idea that one gene for one function, right? There are very few cases like this, the red cone photoreceptor gene, codes for the pigment for the, for that. But those are very rare, as you said. It's mostly systems of genes working in complicated ways, very much like we find in artificial neural networks that have been trained to do something. It's the different artificial neurons aren't just doing one thing. It's rather a sophisticated interaction among all of them that's sort of choreographed to get certain competitions or computations done. So I think that's the view that most have about genes. They're networks, and there's interacting networks, and those also will interact with the environment, right? So your environmental interaction will change which gene networks are being activated, as you found in your own research. But in some sense, it's sort of obvious, even as we just sit here and talk, we're each learning something. Our nervous systems, as we learn something, are being changed. How are they being changed? Well, synapses in the brain are being altered. Maybe some new receptors are being placed in a postsynaptic membrane. Maybe some receptors are being removed. How do we do that? We have to go to our genes to get the instructions for those receptors and so forth, to build them and put them in there. So anytime you learn something, that environmental activity of just listening to a conversation like this and learning something means that your environment has reached in there and activated certain gene networks and caused a change in the structure of your brain. It is rather, I still remember my shock the first time I realized, anytime I learn something, it goes all the way down to my genes. The genes have to be triggered to produce the receptors that go into the postsynaptic membranes that let me change my synaptic sensitivity so that I've learned something, right? So from that point of view, I mean, it's no surprise that the environment is affecting our gene activity. It would be a surprise otherwise. But until you actually see it and realize that it's going all the time, it is a bit of a surprise. But so that's going on all the time. And so we even see cases where, if in some species, and we'll talk about this perhaps later as well, if the species has a single queen and that queen dies, then that environmental effect can trigger the genetics of one member of the species or several to try to become the new queen. You might have a sex change operation based on the environment using your genes. And so this shows that absolutely there's this, and so I don't think there's any serious scientists in this realm who would just say, genes are everything. It's really this really sophisticated interplay between genes and environment that we're really trying to unravel. And it's fun. That complexity is incredible. It also means it's going to be very, very hard. I mean, that's job security for people in this area, because that's really complicated to understand these interacting patterns between gene networks and the whole complexity of our environment.
So Don, you and I and Jennifer are having a conversation right now, right? Which means our cerebral cortices are interacting with each other. So far, so good. Okay, so in order for our cerebral cortices to interact with each other, there has to be some flow of information and energy between the three of us. And our friend at UCLA, Dan Siegel, is one of the few people that actually came up with a good definition of mind, I think, because we talk, I move in circles where we talk about mind all the time, and yet nobody has a definition of mind. So Dan Siegel has a definition that is pretty well accepted in neuroscience circles and neuropsychiatry circles. He says the mind is an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information, and then he stops there. Okay, the mind is an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information, I assume, in an ecosystem of living beings. I would assume that's expansion of that definition. Embodied, relational, regulates energy and information in an ecosystem of living beings. Right now, human beings, you, me, and Jennifer. And we are now actually regulating each other's and being regulated by each other, our nervous systems, just at this conversation. And this conversation is triggering genetic activity at a cellular level, at the level of DNA and neuropeptides and base pairs and all of that, to trigger the release of proteins, which are absolutely necessary for these neural networks to interact with each other, but also between us, between all of us. So right now, if this conversation was scary, if I said there's a threat, nuclear threat right now, or cyber hacking is happening right now, or pandemic is getting worse, then immediately all of us would secrete cortisol, adrenaline, our inflammatory markers would go up. All this requires genetic modulation at a very basic level, and the regulation of energy and information. At the same time, if I suddenly said to somebody else, let's say that I had a meaningful relationship and she was or he was in South Africa, I sent them an emoticon, a hug and a kiss, and suddenly they have a dopamine hit or a serotonin hit as a result of watching something on the internet. So what I'm saying is, where is this thing that we call mind? Because you can't localize it anywhere. Even with this discussion, I can't say where the mind is. But certainly now with the new technologies, VR, the internet, we are creating a new mind for the planet just through our interactions and are trying to understand what we call the case against reality. In other words, even our current science is leading us to a whole new theory of mind, of life, of brain, because so brain is here, it's this control center. But now we know the brain is in the gut. We know there are neurons in the heart. We know that the gut has more neurons than the brain has. We know that gut produces more serotonin than the brain has. Bottom line, we said earlier, you said, biological organism and environment. Even that may be an artificial distinction, because what we call biological organism and environment is one whole process. It's a unified process where I would say in consciousness, but I want to ask you, is what you just said about, even having a conversation changes our brain, changes our genes, changes our neural networks. But actually, when we extend this conversation on the internet, it changes brains globally. It changes brains. Anybody watching in South Africa or Botswana or China, their brains are changing. Is there a physical reality at all if we understand epigenetics and this new science of holism in biology?
Right. So holism versus what is the standard view or has been for a long time in science, which is reductionism, right? So in science, for the last 4 centuries at least, we've had great success actually with a reductionist point of view, which roughly is that if you want to understand nature more and more deeply, you need to go to smaller and smaller scales, right? So you look, the smaller you look in space and time, the smaller the scale you look, the more likely you are to encounter deeper and deeper structures of reality. And so one way that comes up a lot is that people will say that you are, a reductionist would say, you are your microphysical particles and their interactions. Those particles have descriptions at very, very many scales. At a very, very high scale, you might interpret their interactions as what we call your mind or your emotions or your body or your neural networks of your brain. So there's many, many levels, but from a reductionist point of view, in some sense, the fundamental reality is the smallest, say the microphysical particles in space and time, and everything else is that, I don't want to say it's nothing but that. Many of them would not want to say it's nothing but that, because there's some richness to the description that you give it at various scales. So it's not so much a nothing but attitude, but it is the idea that you get closer and closer to the fundamental reality at smaller scales. Now, that's been quite successful, as we have studied in smaller and smaller scales, right? We have united things. Maxwell united electricity and magnetism in his equations, and out came light. Light got united with that. Then we discovered the weak interaction between particles, and we got another unification at smaller scales, the electroweak unification. And then people are looking for grand unification at a really, really small scale between the strong force. And so, and what we hope in this picture is that as we go to smaller and smaller scales, we get deeper and deeper unification and more fundamental laws. And so, but here's the problem. Our best theories, we have to take them very seriously, right? As scientists, we have to just look at what our best theories, like evolution by natural selection, quantum theories, special relativity, general relativity. We have to look at them and not see in them what we want to see. We have to let them tell us what they say. And all of them are telling us something very, very interesting. Reductionism has had a good ride, and it's over. Space-time is doomed. That it's not the case that as we continue to go to smaller and smaller scales, we're tapping into the more and more basic and ultimate constituents of objective reality. Instead, so from when you put special relativity and quantum mechanics together, those two with gravity, well, gravity comes out actually, gravitons come out from that. What you find is that the notion of a local position in space and time ceases to exist beyond a certain scale. It's literally not something that you can use. It's not operational. Now, you might say, well, so what? I mean, it's perfectly fine if it's not really well defined beyond a certain scale. And we learned in quantum theory, when we came to quantum theory, we learned that if something is not precisely defined, you should pay attention. So we used to think under Newtonian physics that position and momentum were both precisely defined at the same time. And quantum theory came along with Heisenberg uncertainty principle, said, no, they're not. And you can imagine someone with the attitude, well, look, who cares? I can still compute position and momentum together to 13 decimal places. So who really cares that they're not precise? It turns out that would have been the very, very wrong attitude, but because taking very seriously that you cannot know position and momentum precisely, forced us to completely change the mathematics. The worldview from quantum theory is a revolution compared to classical theory. Things are very, very different. So when we take very seriously, our theories telling us you cannot know those variables precisely. And we say, okay, we're going to be students of our theories. And our theories are telling us you cannot talk about space and time beyond a certain limit. The reductionist drive works, and then all of a sudden it's over. You cannot go smaller. In fact, as you try to go smaller, you start to probe bigger and bigger and bigger spaces. It's really quite strange, right? So as you use smaller and smaller wavelengths to try to probe smaller and smaller regions of space, you get more and more energy. Energy equals mass. The mass creates a black hole, and bang, you've destroyed space at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So you might say, well, look, that's so small. Who cares? That's the wrong attitude. We should listen to our theories. They're saying space is only an approximate concept. And that means that reductionism has, and by the way, reductionism has had a really good ride for 400 years. It's really been very, very useful. But when our theories tell us it's over, we need to first, have to ask, why is it over? And second, why did it work so well while it was working? It's really an interesting question. We can talk about it. I have some ideas on that. Why it worked and why it's been so successful and why it's over. So the reductionist view is now turn to holism now. We have to be very, very careful when we turn to holism, because here's the attitude that scientists will have, and rightfully so. They're going to say, look, we have mathematically precisely defined our theories. We've mathematically precisely defined our theories of space and time and evolution by natural selection and so forth. And it's our theories that have told us, wake up, slap us around, wake up. Reductionism fails beyond a certain scale. It's just over. They're going to say, for holism, that's great. That's an idea, but it's not a scientific theory. Until we have a mathematically precise scientific theory of holism, we're not playing in the same field as them, right? So when we talk about holism, we have to be very, very careful to say, look, we're not saying that we've got something that's replacing the science right now. We're saying we have an idea that will point us to humbly look for a mathematically precise theory of holism that may at some point contend with the current scientific theories, right? I think that's, if we have that attitude, then scientists can hardly object, right? If we claim that we have overthrown them without a theory to replace it, they should reject us out of hand, and of course they would.
So Jennifer, you can interject right now, because I have a very direct question based on what Don has said. But so far, do you have any insights into where this conversation should go? Because I need to follow up on one thing with Don.
I have so many questions, as always. There are two questions that are bouncing around in my mind right now. And the first, Don, goes back to your idea of conscious agents that you talk about in your book, The Case Against Reality, is the idea of these conscious agents. And I think it might even have been in a recent episode where you address this issue, is that moment by moment, it's almost like by looking at holism or by looking at reductionism, whoever is doing the looking, that conscious agent is then, boom, creating a new reality, and a new reality, just like we were talking about in the beginning with our genes. So I would love to know your thoughts, Don, before we go back to Deepak's question, on what role conscious agents have, whether we're talking about holism, reductionism, or epigenetics. how does that play a role in how the world is showing up and how, to Deepak's earlier point, we're all interacting right now? Because I just said those words, each of us as a conscious agent is now making different choices that is then going to redirect reality.
So maybe give it me one sentence that you now, because there's a lot there, maybe one sentence you'd like me
Like
to
I
focus
said, John,
on.
this is my mind. My mind is like one big,
It's perfectly fine. I just want to make sure I really address what you want me to address.
Well, what I would love to know, Don, is from your perspective, what role conscious agents play in genetics?
Oh, in genetics. Well, okay. There's a long way to go before I can answer that question precisely, right? So I should just say what we're doing with the conscious agents. So
Yes, please do define conscious agents. That would be beneficial as well for people who haven't.
right. So as I was saying to Deepak, you know, if we're going to say reductionism is dead and we want a holistic theory that's, by holistic, I mean not tied to locality in space and time, right? So it's non-spatial, non-temporal in some sense. So what we have to do then is to try to get a mathematically precise theory of what we're talking about, right? And of course, we're going to be wrong, but that's the whole point in science, is that you put down mathematical theories and then everybody jumps in and beats you up and you come out bloodied, but you've learned something and the theory gets revised and so forth. And so that's what it's about. And so I've published with my colleagues, several colleagues, a mathematical model of conscious agents. It's mathematically precise. And the idea at a top level is that it's a minimal structure that captures that conscious agents have conscious experiences, like the taste of chocolate, the smell of garlic. And those experiences inform their choices. And those choices lead to actions which affect the experiences of other conscious agents. Okay. So it intuitively, right, I'm not going to tell you all the math, and that's not appropriate here, but it is appropriate to say that there is math, and the goal is to get math, right, because we're trying to do science. But intuitively, it's a vast social network. Each node in the network is a conscious agent that has the structure I just talked about of experiences affecting decisions and so forth, all spelled out mathematically. And the goal of the mathematics is that I can now run simulations and prove theorems about the network dynamics. And I can also then say, okay, I'm claiming that in some sense, this dynamics is more fundamental than space and time. Then the question comes up, okay, how do space and time arise then? If conscious agents are fundamental, space and time are not. They must be derivative somehow. They must derive from this network of conscious agents. How, right? Because that's going to be the question everybody asks. Oh, say conscious agents are fundamental, space and time is not. Then you owe us a mathematical theory about where space and time comes from, and precisely how does it come from the agents and their interactions. How does that come about? So that's what I'm working on with my colleagues. We're trying to show how that arises. And I can sketch our ideas on that, but to answer your question, Jennifer, in a sentence, I need that whole theory before I can answer your question about where do genes fit in with the theory of conscious agents, because I have to show you where space and time come from, where physical objects in space and time come from, and then I can answer your question about genetics. And so you can see that as a scientist, there's a lot of work, and I can tell you about, I mean, we're doing the work, and I can tell you about the work, but the answer to your question is deep.
Okay, so let me then follow up on what Jennifer said. Since Don, you already have a mathematical theory that says space-time is not fundamental, correct?
Correct.
You have a mathematical theory, right?
Right.
Okay. If space-time is not fundamental, then the objects in space-time are also not fundamental, and you've said that. You've said that, and you actually led this movement called Case Against Reality. So if objects are not fundamental, then genes are not fundamental, and networks of genes are not fundamental, and networks of neural networks are not fundamental. They are the expression of something else, whatever that is, okay? So it's one step, only one step, I think, and I'm speaking as a layperson, where you take your theory of case against reality to show us that we can, based on what you're saying, literally come up with a new theory of evolution. And not only that, we can guide evolution because we are also conscious agents participating in a holistic ecosystem of conscious agents. At least theoretically, that would be the practical application of our understanding that for all practical purposes, since, we say, yeah, biological organisms are not fundamental, space-time is not fundamental, brain is not fundamental, genes are not fundamental. We can say that. What good is it if we can't improve our life on this planet, even though our life itself as biological organisms is part of the case against reality? We can still upgrade the quality of our life, which we need to do if we want to get rid of the pandemic, or we want a better economy, or we want driverless cars, or we want to get rid of fossil fuels. All these are very big issues on the planet right now. Fossil fuel consumption, climate change, eco-destruction, extinction of species, war, terrorism, mechanized weapons of death, cyber warfare. So whatever the conscious agents are doing, the human conscious agents are definitely looking at a collective insane suicide mission right now. And I think we're collectively going in the direction of disaster. And this is very practical. Whether or not reality is real or not, it's practical on the quality of our existence on this planet as this conscious agent or biological organism. And if you say you have the math that destroys space-time, there's only one step further. If it destroys space-time and objects and causality in space-time, if it does, then the holism needs a math. And that math is a derivative of the math you already have.
Right. So I would just phrase it slightly differently, that I wouldn't say my math destroys space-time. It's rather that our best scientific theories, special relativity together with quantum theory and gravity, tell us that space-time can't be fundamental. So it's our best physicalist theories that tell us that, I wouldn't say they destroy space-time. I would say that they tell us space-time has been a very useful tool, but it's not fundamental. We thought it was fundamental, and it was a useful assumption for 4 centuries, and we now realize it's over. It's not fundamental. So I would just put it that way. Now, the mathematical model of consciousness, some people might say, well, look, science is reductionism. Science is nothing but talking about particles in space and time and fields in space and time and how they evolve. How could you possibly say that you have a scientific theory beyond space-time? And I have to say, science is not any particular theory. Science is a method for evaluating theories and testing theories and discarding theories and so forth. But physicalism is not science. Science is not physicalism. Physicalism is a particular theory. The idea that space-time is fundamental is a particular theory that has been useful for 4 centuries, and now we realize that we have to go deeper. And science is up to the task. Now, so it's not a contradiction to say that we could have a theory of consciousness that's mathematical, that goes beyond space and time. So a lot of people say that just makes no sense at all, because science just is what happens in space and time, and physics is what happens in space and time. No, you've got it wrong. Science is a method. It's not any particular theory. It's a method for evaluating theories, revising them, or if necessary, throwing them away.
So, let me ask you directly then, do you think we will be able to direct evolution on this planet in the future?
I think that if we get a mathematically precise theory of consciousness and show how space-time arises as a visualization tool of that dynamics of consciousness. So that's going to be the trick. We're going to have to show that everything that we see, particles, objects in space and time, are all just a visualization tool for how that's simplifying the actions of consciousness. Once we understand that mapping, then we will be able to do more than what you just said. We'll be able to, I think, play with the very structure of space-time itself, right? We will, once you understand how the headset works, you can play with the headset. You have all sorts of ways that if you just take the headset as the ultimate reality, you sort of get stuck. If I'm playing virtual reality of Grand Theft Auto, I play the steering wheel, I play by the rules of the game. If I'm the software engineer who understands how this headset works, I can play with the software and change the very space of the Grand Theft Auto game itself. That's what we're, I think, going to be able to do. So what we will have to do, though, is show how evolution by natural selection, our current physicalist theory, special relativity, quantum theory, all of these theories, we will have to show how they arise from the dynamics of consciousness by a mathematical projection into the headset. So we have a lot of math to do. The mathematical model of consciousness, its dynamics, which is, by the way, new math. Network dynamics is brand new math. It's in the last few decades that we've really started to look at dynamics on graph. This is not easy stuff. So it's going to be a lot of fun. There's a lot of job security on this too. But we have to get all that dynamics, understand it, understand how maybe the asymptotic, the long-term behavior of the dynamics gets compressed into what we call space and time. Is it just a simplified interface? Once we understand that, we better get special relativity, evolution by natural selection, quantum theory as our headset view of the dynamics of consciousness. Once we have that all in place, then we'll say, okay, now we understand the software that's running the headset. Now we can play. So then the answer to your question will be, we can do what you suggested and far more. So it's going to be, I'll put it this way, the history of science has been, when we understand with mathematical precision a new aspect of reality, like when Maxwell wrote down his equations, it transformed the world. We're talking here because
we're speaking because of that equation. Right now we're having that conversation.
We're literally at, I'm on the west coast of the United States. Are you on the East Coast?
No, I'm in San Diego. But
you're in San Diego. But Jennifer, are you still in Portugal?
Yeah, we're speaking to people all over the world.
That's right. That happened. That would have been a miracle, say 200 years ago. So if I said we would be doing this, that would be like, it must be just an absolute miracle. There's no way that you could do that.
And yet done, it was predicted in that equation, right?
Well, yeah, Maxwell's equations sort of gave us the hard-nosed tools that let us understand what's going on. And by the way, it's an incredible gift. A few scribbles on a piece of paper. It's miraculous. For me as a scientist, it's awe-inspiring that we can scribble something on a piece of paper. If we get it right, it allows us to make technologies and understand the world in a deep way. And then it also tells us its limits. It says space-time isn't fundamental. It's truly, we've been given this incredible gift. I don't understand that yet, why it is that mathematics is giving us so much insight, but it does. And that's why we need to use the mathematics in our mathematical model of consciousness. But once we have that, then the technologies, we've just seen over and over again, the technologies that come out of that just blow your mind. They're miraculous. Okay, so Jennifer, last words from you, because before we finish, the second
I was just figuring that
is very interesting, but say a few things and I'd like to give a title to our talk.
It was so funny, Deepak. You and I are literally on the same page of your magazine there. I was just thinking that we could explore in maybe the next episode the idea of induction learning and talk about how we are able to synthesize all of this, which I think is topic 2, which is that evolution shows intelligence. And then we can tie in what Don was just talking about and tie in this idea of the infinite intelligence, just like Maxwell was able to scribble a few things on a sheet of paper and synthesize something that allows us hundreds of years later to be talking to each other from all over the world. Let's explore that from an evolutionary standpoint. And Deepak, I would love for you to maybe just to leave us with a word or two of wisdom about spirituality or we can dive into that in the next one, because we didn't even really get to scrape the surface of how spirituality interacts with all of this.
Well, I think every time we say spirituality, at least this ecosystem, we mean consciousness. So we've been talking about it all the time. Consciousness is synonymous with awareness, with intelligence, and consciousness has to conceive, construct, and become these theories, and then embed itself in these theories to project this reality that we're experiencing right now. Nothing could be more spiritual if we just substitute the word consciousness for spirit. This is what the next item talks about. Instead of natural selection, natural induction, which I like very well. And we can explore this with Don next time. But I'd like to title today's talk, The Case Against Reality and the Possible Future of Planetary Evolution. How's that?
Love it.
Okay.
Don, you okay with that?
Sure.
And then next time we can talk about evolution shows intelligence based on this.
Well, thank you to everybody. This was so much fun. I don't know about everybody else out there, but I'm going to be deep diving into evolution and genetics between now and our next episode, and a little neuroscience on the side for flavor. So thank you guys, as always. Happy holidays.
And I'm also having a conversation, Don, with Rudy tomorrow on the latest in epigenetics. Rudy's come up with some amazing new discoveries, and they pertain to the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So everything we're talking about has immense practical implications.
Amazing,
Excellent.
guys. Happy
Wonderful.
holidays. Good to see everyone.
Yes,
Thank
happy
you.
holidays.
Thanks, Don. Bye.
Okay.
Sure.